I'm going to talk a little bit today about performance as a gesture of hospitality and an act of thresholding. When Emma invited me to come and be here today, she asked if there was anyone I would like to be in conversation with, and I thought for about half a second and said, Vicky Featherstone, please. And I asked Vicky, and she said yes. And she said, but do you want me to chair this conversation? Because I don't really want to be a chair. And I said, I don't want you to be a chair either. In fact, I don't even want chairs. If we could do without those, that would be great, because it is about gesture and it is about movement. Having said that, I was planning to walk around, but I don't want to do that either. And I also don't want to go too far away from Vicky. So I'm going to stay in the chair. So I said, I need you here because otherwise it's all just words. I need you to support the things that I'm saying. And she said, so what you're really asking is for me to be your gesture. And I thought, that's why you're the artistic director of the Royal Court. And that is exactly what she is. Vicky is my gesture today, and it's a great honour to have her, not only because she is just about to be confirmed as a professor at Manchester University. Pretty impressive work for someone who hasn't yet done a PhD. Which I have.
Fraud, yeah.
The talk's in 4 sections, and the first 2 are quite long. Well, they're longer, and the second 2 are shorter because our attention spans will be shorter too. So please bear with me. The word gesture comes from the Latin to carry or bear. It's linked to gestation. A gesture is a movement pregnant with feeling and meaning. Gestures developed long before speech, and they're accompanied everywhere like chaperones for our ideas. They're expressive, idiomatic forms of movement that expand the field of our communication and connection. And theatre and dance are, of course, so implicitly gestural that it hardly seems worth mentioning. They originate in the moving human body and its capacity for physical and verbal articulation, its ability to motivate, demonstrate, I'm not going to wear those, and orchestrate change within ourselves and in others. But as our experiences of the world become increasingly distributed, screen-based, static and synthetic, what can performance do? What can it enact between us that can help us to sustain our common good, our social health, our embodied agency in these precipitous times? And by precipitous, I really do mean things that are falling into oblivion. Species, languages, communities, cultures, landscapes and democracies. How do we expand the field of movement in performance and in practice to suggest and to sustain more constructive, collaborative, creative ways of being in and moving through the world? So I want to talk about theatre and dance when they become intentional forms of gesture or movement outwards into the social realm. Actions which are also enactments of values and ethics and which bring new kinds of relational movement into being. I want to think about the kinds of movement, both mental and physical, which an expanded sense of performance presents and makes possible. And I mean performance and the experience of performance as life skills. Dance and theatre manifest movement, but who moves and how? Who do they move with? Who is moved and where to? What other kinds of movement does this moving make possible? These are emotional, social, and political questions, and they have real impacts on real bodies. What does it mean, both literally and metaphorically, to become unsettled? As Barbara Ehrenreich points out in Dancing in the Streets, the sitting culture of the wealthy West began with the Reformation and the withdrawal by the bourgeoisie from communal dance and festivities. Plays and operas requiring people to remain immobilized, each in his or her separate seat, began to provide an alternative to the promiscuously interactive and physically engaging pleasures of carnival. When John Bunyan experienced the religious crisis that led him to write Pilgrim's Progress, it took him a year to give up dancing. But as Ehrenreich says, he eventually managed to live a fun-free life. 200 years later, and we suffered from that, from having to read that book at school. 200 years later, Jean Rhys wrote of her envy in watching those same festivities now confined to the lower classes on occasional days in the year. And she said, I would give anything to be able to dance like that. The life surging up to us, sitting well-behaved, looking on. Well, why are we so well-behaved? Why do we spend our lives in separate seats? Why do we look on, banging our heads against that fourth wall, when we could be stepping into the complex, challenging, universal process of becoming something together? Becoming kin, becoming kind, becoming common, of the precious threatened commons that we make and sustain together, or not at all. Performance teaches us how to be together, and it's an ancient craft that we need to remember, to put back in our bodies and minds. Remembering follows dismembering. I'm going to mention makers here, not nearly as many as I should, but some at least whose ways of working have changed me and many others. Artists and activists whose gesture doesn't stop with the fanfare of press night or the end of a run. And they include Claire Cunningham, Louise Lowe, Dada Masilo, Evie Manning, Liz Lerman, Leah Rodriguez, Emma Jordan, and also some men. They include Vicky Featherstone, whose surname I worked out is the perfect metaphor for the misbehaviour and the contradictions of live art. And then I realised Featherstone is great, but we've also got Gladstone here today too, so that also works beautifully as a metaphor. They have generated, these artists, performance events in shipyards, favelas and in boxing rings, at abandoned estates and institutions, in factories and flats, on ferries, in drill halls and shops, and in theatres too. These aren't just community participation or site-specific projects, though there may be one or both. They're a kind of third event, an experience that emerges from the communal movement of bodies in places, one which changes or expands our own sense of intentional movement and therefore agency and responsibility towards each other. Responsibility, ability to respond, as Shelley Sachs puts it, in the world. We become ourselves literally through movement. And another one, babies kick in the womb with 10 pounds of force, not just to announce their living presence, but also to send molecular signals throughout their bodies to ensure good bone development. We begin to develop our proprioceptive sense in the womb, our sense of how our bodies are orientated in space. And these bodies are looped throughout the world, through our lives, and we can't fully know ourselves or one another or the world itself independently of them. The choreographer Boris Sharmat says the body is made up of an infinity of gestures performed and received that constructed on a daily basis. It is the medium of its culture and the art that goes with it. And our art itself is a form of movement. Bodies at work, bodies of work, received and performed social and cultural gestures. Or can we know ourselves and one another better by learning and observing our ways of moving as individuals and communities, as societies, as cultures, as a species? Because we are in vast flux. Seismic shift, propelled bodily by governments and corporations, by climate change, war and poverty, by revolution, and by an unsettling of paradigms and old comforts that exclude so many for the sake of so few. History, says the Australian writer Richard Flanagan, is once more moving, but it's moving to fragmentation on the basis of concocted differences. So how do we support and participate in the counter-movement, the moving together in peace and in protest? Protest, to speak for, not against. The stories we tell and how we tell them matter now more than ever because they motivate us, they move us, they have motive force. The stories we tell are acts which lay down pathways for action. Narrative goes, said the great Ursula Le Guin, it moves, story is change. Choreography, like narration, inquires into how things move and how they change. Performance environments are not blank and neutral spaces of acting versus watching. They're systems of relations of which all the bodies present are part. Our bodies, all bodies, are events. They're processes that weave together physical, emotional, personal, political, and social gestures constantly, unavoidably. The economy, said the poets of the Bernadette Corporation in New York, is most of all how we go through the street. Well, how we go through the street speaks of social control, of the increasingly unequal relationship between private and public space. But it's also, as Jane Jacobs made clear, the story of our participation in the world and in the lives of others. A story is a metaphor in motion, and ways of moving can be models for living. Le Guin wrote, I seek the nature, the subject, the words of the other story, the untold one, the life story. Well, in that other story, the life story, who gets to dance? What's the dancing about? Where's it happening? How does it arise? Why does it matter? And to whom? These were the questions that were posed in this talk last year by Liz Lerman, and I've been thinking about them with Liz and a group of performance makers in Banff. This was the day we explored chaos theory through leggings. So in a sense, these thoughts are an intentional gesture of response to Liz's offering, another small phrase in the long conversation of culture. Art doesn't or shouldn't merely speak of and about, it has to speak with. It must stand beside, give things new form. If it moves us, it can help us think, and we can't think without moving. You can't expect other people to make meaning for you, said Anne Bogart in the aftermath of 9/11. You can't wait for someone else to define your life. You make meaning by forging it with your hands. It's action that forges the meaning and the significance of a life. Vicky, gesture. So I can get her to do anything I want now. You tweeted...
After that you can, I'm really moved.
You tweeted last year about a friend's phone. This was really why I wanted you to be here with me. You tweeted last year about a friend's phone auto-correcting the phrase Young Writers Festival to Unrighteous Festival. And I love that so much. And I love the fact that comes from the woman who is the most influential person in British theatre, and this is her Twitter profile pic. That is an unrighteous gesture, and those are the kinds of gestures that I'm interested in and that I think we need to make many more of. So can we talk about unrighteousness as a gesture, Vicky? And maybe start with talking a little bit about Our Lady of Perpetual Succour. And what is the gesture of that piece, of your work more widely? So
Our Ladies of Perpetual Succour was an adaptation of a book written by Alan Warner that Lee Hall and I made into a piece of theatre. But the unrighteous gesture of that piece was about, in terms of the form of that piece, which was a sort of musical storytelling, was about the role of how we place those women on stage, for me. And there were lots of men in their story, and it was a big breakthrough very early on when Lee was saying, how are we going to get the men to act all those parts? I said, they're not even going to be in the space. Because for me it was about that the women themselves had to be in control of the way they were depicting the men, who in another circumstance would be incredibly dangerous towards them.
Right.
And if they were in control of depicting it, we were able to see them as strong, not ever feel genuinely fearful for them on stage. And the big thing for me about that was, how can you put young women on stage who are unbelievably sexual at that point in their lives? They're all seeking to lose their virginity, do all these things. How can we really feel the pulse of that and not look at them as sexualised? So that was the big challenge for me about that piece. How could we do that?
Can we talk a little bit about Pussy Riot and the Pussy Riot riot that took place at the Royal Court? This was before you arrived, wasn't it? It was set up by the playwright Emma Crowe. What happened there? What was the gesture of that event?
The gesture of that event, which I think is so important, is that when we have kind of power and we have civic spaces, that we can respond to an artist needing to respond to a moment of something that's happening really quickly. And so often the way that we're funded and everything is about long development, which is important. Yeah. But really, it was about Emma going, we need to do something to question and support how this has happened and what this is doing. So it was an event where they took some speeches, some pieces from Pussy Riot. It was put on kind of in the
Had they just been convicted?
They'd just been convicted. Yeah, okay. That's just what happened. Yeah. And she needed to respond to that. Yeah. So for me, the thing about that is about, are we able, those of us who have the power, to give the space immediately to hand over to artists who need to ask the questions that we need to ask of the things.
But so do you have to set aside resources to make that possible? Or do you go into the year with space potentially set aside for something?
In an ideal world we would, but we never do that. It's really important that we are just able to respond in that way to what the artists need us to do at that point.
And do you find that you're doing that every year? Are you coming across something that has to be spoken and said and
all
done?
The time.
Yeah,
often.
Yeah, well, I hope there's more and more of it. Tell me about Ellie Kendrick's play Whole, because we talked about that the other day, and I love the description of it as being about women singing, moving and taking up space.
Yeah. So Ellie Kendrick, who is an actor, joined our young writers group, or our writers group, or our unrighteous group. Yes. And she created this piece of writing which is absolutely mind-blowing. She didn't realise she had it in her. And it starts off as a young woman who has been attacked on her way home, and so she's been seen as a whole. And as the piece progresses, the whole world breaks open. The world breaks open into one massive black hole, and from it come the furies of all womankind, in all shapes, sizes, colours, backgrounds. There is Beyonce in there, and as it breaks open, we are re-given a space to be able to think about. And she literally, had been in a few plays and didn't realise she had that in her.
Wow. Has that been produced yet?
No, they're just about to go into rehearsal, so it's a very exciting moment.
When does it open?
It opens sometime in October.
We'll all be there. Okay. That sounds absolutely extraordinary, not at all ambitious for a young writer. That same tweet that you wrote about, the Unrighteous one, also changed the word dramaturg to drunkenness, which I like too. It was a really great bit of spell checking there. But that's how I like to think about dramaturgy now, as a form of drunkenness, sort of crashing into things and knocking them over.
David Greggs, who runs the Lyceum, who's an extraordinary writer and theatre person in Scotland, he was the dramaturg at the National Theatre of Scotland, which I set up, and his son said, "Why are you a dramaturgy?" So there's also that.
Yeah, dramaturg is another one that comes up fairly regularly. You spoke also about our responsibility, our changing responsibility, in a conversation that we had not long ago, and which is to come forward and to be present and to be awkward. Did you enter the court with awkwardness?
Fuck yeah.
Yes, up your sleeve. I remember talking to you right at the beginning when you just got the job and you said, I'm going to last for a couple of months.
Yeah.
And I don't give a shit, but I'm just going to go in there and I'm going to do exactly what I need to do. And here you are, how many years later?
5. And now I'm never leaving, institutionalised. Sorry, Graham, you're never going to get rid of me. I feel that we've got to a place where we feel we have to behave well in order to get on. And I think that is the most dangerous thing that is happening to us. And I feel that I didn't really realise that was the case, because I'm in a generation where we didn't have to behave well to get on. It was kind of admired as a woman, for all the wrong reasons probably, that you were slightly kind of contentious.
Yeah.
But I really observed the people who are trying to work their way through the terrible hierarchy that we create and the pathways that we offer in order to get on, and they have a real fear of being seen as, especially to do with kind of race, ethnicity, people who are on kind of the margins, about being seen as being loud, about being over political, about being all of those things. So we end up with a sort of diluted central space and anger around the edges, but anger which doesn't feel it can do anything.
Boris Sharmatz's manifesto for a national choreographic centre started by removing the words national, centre and choreographic from the title. Such a space, good gesture, such a space, he argued, must be created not only by experienced choreographers, but also by those who don't yet know where the national choreographic centres are to be found. Because dance is more than choreography, it's more than, and it's wider than any physical or geographical centre. So Sharmatz created a dancing museum in Rennes, Brittany, and it came into being, he argued, as soon as the first gesture was performed. Displacing gesture from one context to another can challenge the embodied constraints of tradition, law, class difference, racial and gender stereotyping, perceptions of disability and visibility. The unbalanced, unsettled body, the body out of place, the refugee body of 1 in every 113 people now on Earth, both draws attention and is itself attentive, alert, preparing for change. Disruption awakens us all from our tendency, as Laurie Penny puts it brilliantly, to confuse our comfort zones with high moral ground. In Give Me a Reason to Live, Claire Cunningham responded to the work of the painter Hieronymus Bosch, who frequently depicted beggars as disabled, with a series of personal physical tests which activate emotional responses in an audience to disability on the spectrum of sympathy, empathy, and apathy. In her words, this is the unstable ground upon which the bodies of disabled people have traditionally been placed at the whim of others. But in her dance projects, Claire turns instability and disorientation into productive modes of thought, including thinking about and enlarging the scope of choreography itself. Working in dance, Claire said, my perspectives were shifted and altered so dramatically to find that there were possibilities actually because my body is the way that it is, because it's used crutches and it's evolved in such an intricate way that it offers far more opportunity for me than if I wasn't disabled. And if you've ever seen Claire Cunningham move over rocks by the sea or get into a boat, it's a really astonishing thing. She's so much more adept than I am. What looks like an edge from my centre might be your actual centre. Disability, responsibility. By disturbing words, bodies and actions, we become more attentive to their meanings and possibilities. We make them wider. Leah Rodriguez's Pindorama is a dance work created in Rio's violently policed favela de Mare. It's about the country's colonial oppression of its indigenous population. The audience stands in bare feet, sensing disorientated feet among the dancers who are naked throughout. The only other materials on stage are a large sheet of plastic and dozens of condoms filled with water, which are broken one by one until the space is flooded. And we stand looking down on those performers in confusion and compassion, our bodies clothed and apart, our power in our position relative to theirs on the floor, and in our freedom of movement. Perspective matters, and that old, static, head-clamped, ethnocentric, normative, one-eyed, monocular, vanishing point, patriarchal perspective no longer suffices. We know too much and much too little about how the world works to settle for that one anymore. Rodriguez makes no distinction between her dance and the heterogeneous society in which she works. And she doesn't allow her audience the luxury of witnessing without feeling, without full sensory connection, a cold-footed connection to the spaces we share, the lives we touch and are touched by, tangibility, sensibility, responsibility. The word gesture emerges also from the same roots as gist, ghost, and guest. It's such a capable word. It's meant at different times an action, a suggestion, a way of moving, a pause in a journey, a spirit, and a visitor. And all these meanings converge in the idea of meeting, communication, offering, and encounter. The gesture, guest, or gist creates a space between. Our lives are a succession of thresholds between the known and the unknown, the lived and the not yet lived. These borderlands move with us, and like the actual, though far more violently defended borderlands between nation states, they're places of risk and opportunity. But the truth is that on these thresholds between the known and the unknown, we too, like little nation states, often aggressively defend our own identities against the encroachment of other lives and other forms of movement, of the elderly, people with disabilities, children, indigenous and racially and socially othered bodies, gestures and idioms. Disabled artist Sarah Hubolt spoke in 2016 of the nasty edges of the parameters that she worked within. Edges created, in her view, both by exclusion, but also by the patronising, flattening assumptions that can underlie inclusion. In other words, by a cultural habit that responds to difference with some form of denial. You're not like me, or you're so like me that you're not like yourself. But the threshold between exclusion and inclusion, those two forms of invisibility, is, I think, the most productive place to live, work, meet others, make art, make change, and be seen on your own terms. I think performance as a social gesture has the responsibility to try and dissolve those sharp and nasty edges by creating and holding open intentional threshold spaces. I think the most resonant performances push those thresholds out into the bounded territories of our lives, producing wider and wider, more than conventional spaces of involvement, spaces of ambiguity, multiplicity, interruption and incompleteness, where performance itself has no clear beginning or end, where our sense of humanity expands and reverberates in the unexpectedness, diversity, complexity and difficulty of encounter, places where it's okay to be uncertain and hurt and foolish. And on these thresholds, diversity itself has the opportunity to assume self-willed and disruptive, unrighteous forms of presence and agency. This is the long section, sorry. Across our cities, these threshold places, places of encounter and exchange, are diminishing as actually or even notionally public. Anti-homeless spikes, commercialisation and privatisation of commoning spaces, and relentless orchestrated flows of people, traffic and information reduce our experience of other lives lived at other speeds, lived with less liquidity, mobility, opportunity. But bare lives, says the poet Fred Moten, only turn out to be bare insofar as no attention is paid to them. Enteleki Arts in London made a social gesture, an act of thresholding with bed. An elderly woman lies in a bed in the middle of a city street. People stop, confused and concerned. They ask if she's okay, what to do. She speaks to them about loneliness, forgiveness, fragility and care, and they speak back. They stop passing by, and they begin to reflect on their own lives and loves and fears. The performer in the bed gently encourages this dialogue. Bed began with structured conversations between the work's performers and its potential audiences. Slowly, together, through regular meetings, encounters and conversations, they learned how to help people sense the space between them and then choose whether and how to enter it. The process is embedded, literally, in the work, and it makes its gesture simultaneously an intervention in the social fabric and an invitation. A performance gesture might flag up an absence, or it might draw attention to an unacknowledged presence. In Is This a Wasteland, part of Dance Umbrella last year, Charlotte Spencer took us bodily into the marginal spaces of cities, and by giving us communal tasks to do there, she drew attention to them as unmade environments ready for remaking. But how? On whose terms? For whom? Is This a Wasteland expanded my understanding of urban geography, not by asking me to look for beauty in unbecoming places, but by inviting me to move through them, to understand that these spaces are always becoming, and that markets, makers and materials move too, become present or absent according to larger global ebbs and flows. Sites, like bodies, are articulated, sensed and known by the movement performed within them, and the movement of bodies is affected by sites. Economics is how we go through the street. Louise Lowe and Anu Productions' Laundry led us into and through the abandoned Magdalen laundries. Don't do this. In Dublin, restoring narrative and voice through intimate micro-performances to the silenced lives of the fallen women and girls forced to labour there. I moved through those spaces, my hand in the hand of a performer whose story had been handed to her by one of the survivors of that blasted place. I was moved beyond words. Laundry ended for each of us with the gift of a bar of stinking red carbolic soap, and now and then that vile institutional smell puts the entire experience of the work back in my body. I've had this for 7 years. Laundry began on an actual institutional threshold, and it ended inside its audiences in an antiseptic inhalation that changed our emotional chemistry forever. When other stories become a part of us, we have to take responsibility for them. And I'm going to hand this around and put this disgusting inhalation into your bodies now too, because I want you to think of the women who worked in the Magdalen laundries in Dublin and share that with me, because you haven't seen the performance. But give it back to me, because I really need it to keep me honest. To think movingly, gesturally, is also to think ecologically, to enter into and be entered by the world. We require each other, the world and us, in unexpected collaborations and combinations, in hot compost piles, as Donna Haraway says. To think movingly is not only to think of the ground that we stand on, but its horizon and its underground too. Fred Moten writes of the undercommons beneath the surface of neoliberal capitalism. The blackness, he says, that slips free of the structures and processes of contemporary art. Here, he says, are the moving, motley, sculptural, animated, theatrical things. The things that have been othered, marginalised by the trick of politics, which tells them to wait for the arrival of democracy, which will make them more than they already are. But we are, says Moten. We're already here, moving. We're more than politics, more than settled, more than democratic. The Irish playwright Rosalind McDonagh spoke recently about the marginality of disability and traveller culture in Ireland. I'm tired of having to live it, she said, having to talk it, having to represent it, having to fucking write it. We are all the poorer for this lack of diversity. And traveller culture rejects the settled culture of the West and the North that Moten refers to, the sitting culture that limits our embodied knowledge. This is the time for all of us to learn what it is to be unsettled, to lean towards and attend to be unbalanced, moved and taught by the idiomatic languages and gestures of the undercommons, of Indigenous movement, of disability, the homeless, the landless, the not settled, the not human, but also movement forms displaced from the bourgeois centre, social dance, street dance, folk dance, the movement of those who don't even know that they're dancing, those queer forms of movement that don't seek permission or approbation from those of us who are settled, who have settled for the way things are. I'm doing so well on the time here. Vicky, thresholds. What's the invitation? What is the invitation at the Royal Court? What's the gesture that brings people across that space? I want you to talk about that in a specific case, which is Tanya El-Khoury's, as far as my fingertips take me.
You've just created, though, an unbelievable moment, hasn't she, of threshold, as that, you know you've done this, but I just need to, as the soap is being passed and continuously carries on, and I'm experiencing each one of you newly as you smell it. It's incredible.
Really?
Yeah, really.
Oh,
I have goosebumps. So we must enjoy watching and the time it takes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
Keep it going. Keep it going.
I'm actually feeling it in the lungs. It's extraordinary. So we were very fortunate to be able to, part of our international department, Elise Dodgson, who you know well, has got these extraordinary relationships for many years across the world, kind of bringing international voices and supporting them. And a couple of years ago, we made a project with Tanya El-Khoury, which I think is one of the most profound experiences I've ever had in any space, really, in a performative sense. And it was set up, and so bizarre where it was really, in terms of the institution of the Royal Court and its bourgeois nature and the walls of it and all of those things. And you were invited to go and sit behind a screen, and you had to roll your sleeve up and put your arm through this hole. And you know that feeling, it's all about feeling now, when somebody does that, which is like the nicest feeling in the whole world, isn't it? And first of all, you would feel this hand doing this to you, and it was an incredible connection straight away. And then the guy who was the performer, Basra, said, "Yes, I'm a refugee." And it was just that incredible moment when we were all asking that question of what does it mean to be a refugee, and we were really living, as we still do, but in a very kind of pertinent sense, in that fear of refugees. The country was terrified, Europe was terrified of refugees and what that meant. And the frisson, even to me, and he said, "Yes, I'm a refugee," and you realise you're actually touching one, the other, and you have to admit that. That's really massive.
And you can't see his face, or you couldn't
can't see his face. And he's doing this thing, and he's making you feel something, which is what your parents made you feel, or your lover makes you feel, or your best friends make you feel. So it's this extraordinary thing, and then you're going, "Yes, I am one," and the bravery of that. And then he draws on your arm, and you don't know what's being drawn. And again, so it perpetuates the feeling, while he also sings this extraordinary song that he's written about him and his brother's journey from Syria to Germany and then to England. And it's really profound, it's really painful, it's very tortuous in terms of what they go through. He's singing it, and he's drawing on your arm, and at the end of it, he has drawn a border on your own arm, and the journey of the people all queuing up with their suitcases and with everything to try to cross the border of your own body into understanding it. It was extraordinary. And you don't realise what this thing is, because you're experiencing so many different senses, and then you go away. And how can you wash that away?
But people must do, unless they get it tattooed.
But we felt so terrible washing it away. The act of washing it away was our forgetting.
That's the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like that piece of soap, which is about washing away the history of those women's silenced lives. That sounds absolutely extraordinary. And did people respond very emotionally?
Yeah.
Did you find...
People responded really emotionally, as you can tell, and it was a very emotional experience for him to do it as well, for him to perform it. I think everybody thought that he'd created the piece of art himself as the idea, and he was very interesting about being the vessel for the art as well, rather than being it.
Yeah. So intimacy is something that happens in that threshold space if you make it possible, if you make that space and enable those kinds of intimacy. Can you talk a little bit about working with Adrian Howells?
Yeah.
Because he is really the great man, the master of intimacy and kindness.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, isn't it, that I didn't think this would be a connection when we talked about this, but of course about washing.
Of course, yeah.
How weird.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
That we ended up talking about Tanya's piece as the end of it being washed away, and of course what Adrian Howells made with these incredibly, for those of you who don't know, but these incredibly intimate, initially one-on-one pieces, where he would literally invite people only if they wanted to be bathed by him, or he would bathe your feet, and you would talk to him, and you would have these extraordinary sort of therapeutic, held moments of experience with him. And what we didn't realise at the time was the thing that held that so much was his vulnerability. Of course, he ended up taking his own life, and I think those of us who knew him didn't, there are some people. I was very close to Sarah Kane. I knew that was possible. I didn't know that with Adrian. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's something that you didn't realise in the vulnerability of the act, that actually what you're experiencing was his vulnerability first and then your own, but that's in retrospect. But the main piece of theatre that we made with him at National Theatre of Scotland was when he came and he said, there is a disused swimming pool in the south side of Glasgow, which used to be a really important part of the whole community, and it's been closed down, and everybody learnt to swim there, and it was a place where the community would go and kind of experience a different sense of being in the water together.
Is that Govan Baths?
Govan Baths.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
And National Theatre of Scotland could do this, and we persuaded them to open up the baths and filled the bath, and he made a piece which was in the water about swimming, and he invited the audience then to get into the water with him as a kind of cleansing, and he held us. But the thing that he used to say was, everything is allowed, which of course has I think in terms of when Adrian used that, was a very important and safe thing. But actually the everything is allowed in terms of the world as we now see it through a different lens. Collectively, as we see it through a different lens, individually we knew that was there already. But as we collectively see it through a different lens, I think the everything is allowed thing is a thing which can feel really dangerous in terms of what is creativity and what is safety and what isn't safety. But I feel that Adrian held that, Tanya's piece held that, and we still have to be allowed to have the intimacy and the touch to feel true empathy.
Yeah, and so theatre and theatre practice, I suppose, can train us in how to be together in ways that are safe and careful. I was thinking about theatre or about the gestures that you make on thresholds and what it is to work in threshold spaces and thinking that performance making or the field of performance is like a form of cultural parkour. It's a way of working with and around obstacles so that we can become adept in different circumstances. And I think it does, because it's so contextual, it does train you about how the body moves and responds in particular contexts. And that feels really important. You talked we've got about 30 seconds in this section to talk about Ed Thomas's piece on Bear Ridge, because that has a couple of thresholds in it. Yeah, so Ed Thomas is a writer in his mid-50s who had plays on at the Royal Court in the olden days. And has been working in television for a long time and has written this incredibly precious, beautiful play, which we're going to do in the autumn. And it's On Bear Ridge is his rough translation from the Welsh of the mountain, where his parents had the abattoir and the butchers. And as his parents died, everything got closed down. The village has been decimated for capitalism, for change, for concrete worlds that have been built up. So it's a kind of elegy to the past life, to the language of Wales, and to the kind of beauty of who his parents were. And the play is extraordinary, but he has this vision, which is part of the exciting thing about the threshold, which is that he's going to recreate the butcher's shop in something which can collapse on exactly the spot that it was on the mountain. So if you're in Wales, you can go and see it deteriorate, like the meat would deteriorate or the thing would break, and that would be there. But the Royal Court version of that, because we can't all go to Wales even though we may, after the play, is that we're working with somebody to create a VR experience that you would actually walk out into the entitlement of Sloane Square and put that on and cross the road into the middle of the square and be up on that Welsh mountain, feeling that thing deteriorate. And that feels, for me, more dangerous or more exciting than even going to the place itself. That's extraordinary. Just in terms of what that thing is and about that experience. Yeah, absolutely amazing. When's that happening? That's happening in September next year. This is a little promotional piece. Nobody knows about these things though, so this is so stumm. Oh, yeah. Another example of thresholding, I think a very profound one, was Lola Arias's Minefield. Yes. Can you just talk a little bit about that before I shut you up? No, shut me up. Again, Lola Arias, an amazing Argentinian theatre performance maker, extraordinary. And again, had worked with Elise over many years in different capacities, and came to us and said that she had this idea with Lift. Lift brought this to us. The other project was Lift as well. About Falklands veterans from Argentina and from this country meeting and making a piece of theatre together, and what that would mean. It was unbelievable the way that you've felt this, I think it's so important that we find spaces for masculinity to be really, truly explored. In terms of smashing the patriarchy, sometimes it's hard to defend that, but this was a real thing which brought these men together, and the understanding and the shock of what they had experienced separately. And one of the stories which really was the threshold for me was that, one of them walked over the spot where the other's best friend literally at that moment had been killed. And they only met making this piece together. And it was a sort of explosion of little boyness as they got up to be in a band on stage, and then contradiction. And, there was a real sort of the thresholds that they crossed over was one of these men, completely heterosexual and the sort of, David with the moustache, was the one that said, I want to dress up as the woman, I want to dress up as the woman. And so many thresholds were crossed in the making of that. Queer Eye. Queer Eye. Perfect. Sasha Davies and Lucy Railton's Everything That Rises Must Dance has brought together 200 dancers this year for Dance Umbrella women dancers, each carrying in her body the everyday movement of women seen in the street. This work deliberately blurs the boundaries of professional and non-professional, us and them, the found and the fabricated. And And I absolutely applaud the multiplicity, the ambiguity, the collapse of category distinctions that happens in work like this. Art making as a social gesture ushers everyone across the boundary of artist and audience and into that threshold space of creation. And there the participants activate the work. Meaning is negotiated here, it's not delivered. The heartbeats of audiences synchronize at live theatre events. This tendency to move together overcomes unfamiliarity and group difference and produces temporary community. I was looking at this piece and realising you couldn't get away with that today with all those cod pieces. When one individual addresses another, the addressee begins to move in time with the speaker, establishing a bond, preparing to enter a dialogue. There are rhythms to our proximity and we're moving to them all the time. Art makes these movements visible and palpable, and it reminds us of how we actually relate, of how we are actually related. In some Indigenous cultures and in some communities of practice, there's a notion of the self as ensemble, a flock inclusive of other selves, and that really resonates for me. The anthropologist Gregory Bateson described this as kinesthetic socialization, the flow and swarm of participation. Quebecois contemporary skaters Le Patin Libre, who I've worked with, thank you, Dance Umbrella, over several years, proposed the actions of flock and glide, both as forms of communal motion on ice, and they are beautiful, but also as metaphors for social movement, a way of thinking about and shaping our interactions. These are ways of living and moving found throughout nature that work with fundamental laws of physics to produce a kind of grace and mutual awareness of the ways in which we share space and move together through this world. Big dance and its communal, idiomatic forms of expression reminds us that public spaces are incorporated in the true sense of being produced by the bodies that move through them. A recent article in eFlux claims that digital platforms aren't expressions of social relations among people, it's the other way around. Our social relations are choreographed by our social platforms. Algorithms are getting inside our heads and they're influencing our decisions and our actions, directing us through over-defined landscapes which dispel the mystery, the uncertainty, the waywardness, and the indirection that come en route to our destinations, the places of disorientation where learning happens. Our own personal gestural repertoires are at risk of shrinking to the neurotic fiddling and twittering of caged creatures. It's so easy, so habitual, this surrender of the body's communicative potential in our online lives, but we need it back. Our patterns of movement and activity reflect our being in the world, and what's true of our individual and our social lives becomes true of our cultures too. Increasingly subject to algorithmia, our own pattern-making minds draw us into obsessive-compulsive iterations, short circuits of thought in an age of anger. Racism, like other acts of discrimination, projects formulaic identities onto the bodies of others and tries to fix them in place. But bodies that move to their own chosen rhythm, in contexts that they have chosen, resist that inscription. These are the bodies of Fred Moten's moving, motley, animated undercommons. The supple languages of resistance require the moving, gesturing body and within the moving, gesturing community for their full expression. These forms of articulation are incredibly important within the contradictions, the scale and the complexities of the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movements. South African dancer and choreographer Dada Masilo's revising of the Western classical tradition, most recently with Giselle, is infused, she says, with the chaos and violence of our times. She didn't want to make a pretty Giselle, but a true one, a Giselle of the undercommons. Akram Khan, too, made a Giselle with English National Ballet, and I worked with him. It maintains the original story, but it changes everything, I think, by articulating movement forms that describe the flux and flood of economic migration in unequal societies. Masilo's Giselle's an African woman of strength and purpose. Khan's is a community activist who leads the resistance of landless garment workers. Manchester in the 19th century, Dhaka in the 21st century. Ian B's Giselle holds the ballet's history in mind, but it threads through it the global economic history of industrial labour and its impact on the lives and bodies of women. We tried in that piece to widen the space of meaning within which that emotionally overwrought young woman with a heart trouble could move and be understood. But it's not easy to cut irrigation channels for new thought and movement. Classically trained dancers have been taught to fight gravity, and so have their audiences. Change takes effort. Una Doherty's Hope Hunt on northern broken masculinity suggests that a whole generation of people here in Northern Ireland are holding an era in their bones, in muscle memory, in tissue. It can seep out into their kinesphere, into the bar and into others. But by moving and speaking with her community, by expressing the grace as well as the gravity of the lives of white Protestant working class Northern Irish men, Doherty creates complex, contradictory images, gestures of compassionate insight and enlarged understanding. And Emma Jordan's Prime Cut Theatre in Belfast, where Una found her first home, has been practicing social choreography for many years, with participatory performance projects that work across the sectarian divide, that find rhythm and poetry in eel fishing and on the waterways, in the lives of former factory workers, across communities divided by hatred, misunderstanding and razor wire. The making draws on lives and labours not often considered subjects of contemporary art, negotiates their meaning with participants and offers them back to communities and wider audiences in physical contexts that train us all to move in new ways towards one another. And the brilliant Evie Manning and Rhiannon White do the same thing in another context in Bradford and far beyond with their company Commonwealth. So, Vicky, checking my time, you've made an entire building into a gesture. Rather than the walls closing around its own performance history, you really have turned the court into an open palm. An invitation to artists and audiences to mutually create meaning there. And it didn't just come overnight, because I think you must have developed some of this learning when you were at the National Theatre of Scotland, where you were presenting work in non-traditional spaces. But you made a gesture when you came into the court. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I really shouldn't have, sorry Graham, again, Graham's got a big feature in this, hasn't it? But I probably shouldn't have taken the job at the court, really, after what I'd learned at the National Theatre of Scotland and what I'd experienced, what we'd been able to put in place, you know, making Claire Cunningham's first piece of work, the Home Project, yeah, all of those things. But so for me, the Royal Court was something which was so exciting, obviously because of the writers and the ideas, but everything that I believed about the world and about our civic responsibility as artists and about enabling artists to do anything they want wasn't really what I saw the Royal Court as, even though it has kind of broken so many boundaries over the years. And what was very interesting for me was I know that writers, when they are primary creators, are absolutely extraordinary, but I also felt that coming back to London, writers probably weren't as seen as cool as they used to be. And how were we going to give them the space to prove that, you know, that they weren't just working into an old kind of patriarchal construct and institution. So I gathered them all together and we came up with this thing, the name my son came up with, which was Open Court. I said, I want to do something to open up the court, but I don't know what to call it. He went, Open Court? I went, done, very good, you know, ask the children, they will answer. And I got all the writers together and I basically said, if we're going to give you the keys to the court, what would you do? And they kind of looked at me in disbelief to begin with. But it was very much about going, if you're asked the question of what do you want to be saying about the world, not just in terms of the play that you have to be in control of the gesture of, but in terms of the gesture of this building and the gesture of this space that you take up in the world as writers, what would it be? So they basically came up with a 6-week programme and I said we would commit to everything that they came up with, but they didn't have to reach consensus or agree with each other. And what that did for me, which was similar to the first project we did at National Theatre of Scotland, is that in a way, if you try and create a manifesto for somewhere and say, I want it to be like this, it's an Arts Council funding bid, or it's like a business plan. If you actually say to people, let's do it, and they come up with what it is, it becomes your manifesto for the future. So I really didn't have to do anything, and we really haven't got to the place that you describe. I wish we had. But the Open Court gesture was the thing that shifted us and the writers forever.
Yeah. But I was literary manager at the court, and I never really got over the difficulty of entering that building. Yeah. It's amazing what an institution and the history of an institution can do to hold you down. I used to turn up with my scripts as a reader and sit, there was then a bookshop across the road from there. I couldn't enter that building. I found it almost physically impossible. And I was there the other night for Stephen Jeffries' farewell, and it felt so easy. It felt easy. Maybe it's because I'm not connected with it directly anymore, but it has changed. It has changed radically. And that has a huge amount to do with you. But
as Zadie Smith says, progress isn't permanent, so it changes in moments. And I don't know, my aim with Lucy before we leave is to do something which means it's changed forever regardless, rather than with programming choices or moments or events, because every single time we get to something which is tight, we retreat to what we already know into the institution.
That's
so
really
that's the big challenge.
They call that punctuated equilibrium in geology. Just
That's
reading about it this morning.
That's why she's amazing.
That's what but you have said, that the building is a kind of monster, and it has great demands of its own, and that will always be problematic.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you've done is set the artists to push against it, to push against the walls and the shape and the containing capacities of that institution. And because I love her, can you talk a little bit about Emma Crowe and what she has become and what you have made possible for a writer like that? She was a young writer when I was at the court.
And Emma Crowe was on the cusp of, she would forgive me for saying this if she were here, but Emma Crowe was on the cusp of becoming what people would call a difficult writer and don't give her a commission. Don't you agree?
Yeah, definitely.
But actually, that was about not creating the right environment for us to be able to listen, to listen to her and be changed by her and create something for her. And I think she's just given me the most extraordinary play, which is where a woman who's just had a child is trying to get to work and the curtain in her bedroom engulfs her. And she can't actually get out of the room because of the curtain. I mean, we're going to do it downstairs. It's extraordinary. But what Emma has started to do is start to use space differently and start to look at what space is. And she said that she used to be scared of the audience, and her writing used to really reflect that she felt she had to be defensive of her ideas and fuck off, and I was allowed to have them. And as soon as we were able to create a conversational space, an emotional space, she went, oh my God, the audience are actually extraordinary. The space between myself and the audience is where it needs to happen. Wow. And it's really shifted her thinking, and what she now gives me in terms of her ideas overall is really extraordinary.
Wow. Talk about gestus.
Oh yeah, the gestus
space between.
thing, the space between. So when Ruth first came to talk to me about this, obviously I was going to chair this once, but now obviously I'm not. She's completely in control, and I'm just like here to let chat. And she talked about gesture. It made me think of the Brechtian word gestus, which, with all the best definitions, you hear once, forget what it really means, and only think about what it means to you as you go forward. So for any kind of Brechtian academics, this is absolutely shit what I'm about to say, but this is what I think it means.
Professor Featherstone.
But for me, this Brechtian thing about gestus is this idea of that everybody has a gestus, a social gestus in terms of who they are in the world. But then if you put that person or that being on stage, the gestus in terms of their action or what they're trying to achieve in terms of the story or the motion or the thing can be a different thing. And I always use this when I'm talking to actors in every single play that I do. So if we're sitting here like this, and it's about where the audience enter into that space. And we know that feeling, because if I sit here and I literally say, Ruth, I love you.
I love you.
No, but you've answered it too quickly. I love you too. But this gap after I say, Ruth, I love you, is the most electric, adrenaline-fueled thing that we're all in together. And that's what Brecht would define as the gestus, which was the moment when we could imagine something different, we could imagine change, we could imagine possibility, we could imagine something. As soon as you say you love me back, it's like, well, that's lovely, but that's that. It's over. You know, but so it's a really interesting thing, I think, about that space.
Yeah.
Can I just say one other quick thing, if I could? The other thing I feel about who is allowed to be in spaces is that we have a piece on at the moment called Poet in the Corner, created by Deborah Stevenson and an incredible team of makers around her, director, amazing producer who's made it all happen. The whole kind of conversation, and it's about grime. And it's this thing about, for me, which has been really profound about it, is that what Deborah wanted to do, having kind of been shifted because of grime, as a dyslexic young woman who was disenfranchised, she really wants us to understand that grime is a new canon. And there's a question about whether the Royal Court should culturally appropriate things like grime in Sloane Square. But actually, it's also really important. And when you speak to people who've been part of that movement, it's really important for the status of where it should be that places like the Royal Court take that. So I'm really interested as well in our responsibility around what that is, about how things are given space. Anyway.
Dizzy Rascal's texts about that production are fantastic. I mean,
who knew?
Yeah, it's all happening. The philosopher Ivan Illich wrote about creating and maintaining community using what he called tools for conviviality. To me, that's what the engaged and rhythmic dancing or moving body is, a tool for conviviality. Akram Khan's company, oh, that's me using tools of conviviality. Akram Khan's company recently held a week of auditions for non-virtuosic dancers, for older dancers, dancers whose bodies communicate idiosyncratically. And Tim Taylor, a non-professional dancer who took part, wrote of his experience that week as truly empowering because he came to understand that the particular qualities of a dancer are transferable to other contexts, including his own field as a teacher and manager in adult education. Dance is a mode of being, he said, that enables new perception, the development of boldness to move with confidence, the awakening of sensitivity as to how the body can move, the finding of courage for change. The Scottish choreographer Janice Parker has for decades built a gentle practice based on conviviality and welcome, developing articulacy with elders, non-professionals, people with learning difficulties and disabilities. It's not simply a matter of opening performance to wider participation, she says. Diversity must and will alter the form of dance itself, generate new movement vocabularies, aesthetics and politics of presence. We could be asking, she suggests, what does it mean to work from a different experience of movement in the body? What does that contribute? How can we support these new vocabularies, dance forms, people and body types in their making and creating? We need innovation in form and function. When performance makers ask an audience to attend, they don't just mean to turn up. They mean to pay attention, to stretch towards, which is what the word actually means, to be present with all our senses, with our questions and our fears and our resistances. They invite us to feel and acknowledge the contradictions in us, the hypocrisy, the heartlessness, humanity and the hope. Theatre and dance can invent worlds, but they cannot invent audiences. And at the same time, though, I think we can collectively do a better job of imagining ourselves as audiences. We can stop thinking of a performance as an isolated event in time and space and start thinking of it as an experience of motive force leading to other things. We've got a role and a responsibility as audiences to be present, to attend, to ask for more varied, probing forums beyond the work itself, and to explore it in the context of now, to challenge, encourage, sustain, inspire, educate, and mentor our artists, our producers, and each other, to play that instrument of social media with confidence and to write about what we've seen and what it means to us. Don't leave it all to the critics. Audiences articulate meaning. They come to hold the story of the work. Theatre and dance increase the lines of connection between people, ideas, pathways of thought and action. In these days of ideological certainty and instant answer, we need to learn to become open to multiplicity and complexity, to think of performance as a kind of I Ching, not so much a device for prognostication, but a tool to think and ask better questions with. I mean, look at the words in terms of asking questions. A tool of conviviality, like darkening light. That's like Featherstone. It's absolutely brilliant. Quantum physics, in Karen Barrad's view, encourages us to think of agency and time as forms of entanglement, not discrete or linear processes. The individual moment, she says, is a dense seed filled with other times and spaces, a field of possibility. The idea of the field in performance making allows us to think more widely about the possibilities of what we all do and how we do it, not to get stuck in and direct all our resources towards performance alone. Mina Morita of Crowded Fire Theatre in San Francisco proposes that as a field, we've got a responsibility to leverage our institutional spaces towards interrogation, dialogue, and building understanding, rather than letting them passively sit in self-celebration. Siobhan Davies has worked this way in the expanded field of performance for many, many decades, and it's impossible, well, not that many decades, sorry, Sue. It's impossible to separate the physical space of her studios from the embodied thinking about art, connection, and meaning-making that goes on there. Emma Gladstone has done the same thing in a different way with Dance Umbrella, produced and curated a sense of common purpose, a curiosity about what dance is and what it can be, that's distributed across a huge range of spaces and forms of encounter. In both cases, the research and reflection extend into the digital sphere and feed back from there into physical forms. And do see Janine Harrington's screensaver as part of Dance Umbrella this year for an extraordinarily beautiful, complex example of that. In both cases, the individual and the organisation are indistinguishable from the practice. The practice becomes an ongoing conversation, and this is the world of Liz Lerman, as described in her book, Hiking the Horizontal, which should be required reading for us all. Artists, producers and curators like these teach us how to move in new ways, and they help us to build vocabularies of movement and response, ask new questions and find uncanny affinity with all things. A motivation is an impulse to movement, and combined with curiosity, it's the foundation of empathy. And Bogart, again, we're meant to be in the room together, undergoing experience, undergoing other people, undergoing life, undergoing ideas, undergoing metaphor, undergoing history. What is the gesture of your work in the world? Can we talk, Vicky, about Anna Deavere Smith and listening, the gesture of listening and her body of listening work?
Yeah, so my experience of Anna Deavere Smith came this year with her extraordinary piece, Notes from the Field, which is from something like 500 interviews with people across America over a long period of time about what she calls the school to prison pipeline, which we obviously have in this country too, of young black Americans. And she understood that her art, or the way that she could interpret this, was not to write a piece about it, but was to listen. And to listen to people's stories, and that her role was to be able to put those stories in front of us in a truly dynamic way, because she knew she could perform it. And I find the confidence of that extraordinary. But really, the main part of this job was the collection and the listening of these stories, and then the forming of that into something which then demands in return that we listen, and that we can't turn away from this proof of this school to prison pipeline. And by hearing that, we are then complicit in making change happen, or making some shift into the future. And you know, their piece that she made in 1994, I think, Twilight, was also about the LA riots and used a kind of similar form. That has ended up being a play, amazing production that Ola Ince did at the Gate of that play. That's actually a play, but I don't think she will ever hand over Notes from the Field. I think Notes from the Field is something that she feels her body has to encompass. And just very quickly, the process of how she does that. I met her before she went back into rehearsals for it, and she said, I won't be able to speak to you like this again until the show is over. And that was like 5 weeks away.
Wow.
She literally has to become monk-like. She doesn't touch people.
Wow.
She has to go, literally can't physically touch people. She has to go into a space to enable that to happen, because she feels she has to inhabit the stories so fully that she listened to, that she doesn't want any contamination around it. It's incredible.
Tell me a little bit about Lisa Hammond and Rachel Spencer's piece, Still No Idea, because I love this. This is a follow-on play that came out of an earlier piece, didn't it?
Yes. So Lisa Hammond is an extraordinary actress, disabled performer. She was in EastEnders. She's worked a lot in lots of different ways. I knew her, first of all, with connections with Improbable, and I've known her for a long time. And so she made a piece as a kind of scratch piece about the fact that when was the disabled artist going to become the centre of the narrative? And not, I mean, she's a brilliant actress, but not that she could just like be in it. When was the form going to be a form that she felt that she was in control of? And when was that going to happen? So she made this piece where she asked the audience to write what the narrative would look like, with her at the centre of the narrative and control of it as a form. And of course, people couldn't really come up with what's interesting about that. There was a kind of failure of idea and imagination within that. So it couldn't really work. Then she got this amazing part in EastEnders. Right. And she was like, I'm there. I'm there in the centre of our evening viewing as a country. I'm doing the thing. And after 4 or 5 years, I don't quite many years, she never got a main storyline. And she'd go all the time and ask what the main storyline was. So she came back to me and she said, I think I really want to make this piece of work again, doing the same thing in the first half, but going the moment that I thought happened and I still didn't get it. And what does that actually mean?
So you went from no idea to still no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
The two versions of that piece.
So who knows? We'll see.
Yeah, but that's also, hasn't it, it's involved asking members of the public for their views on disability? Or
yeah, views on disability, what they feel it means, what it represents, and what kind of story she should be allowed to tell.
That's a can of worms.
What's fascinating about it is that people really can see her in Shakespeare plays, but nobody's giving her a contemporary narrative.
Really?
Isn't that interesting?
Really?
Well, because it's safe, comfort
Right.
again.
Yes, yeah, comfort.
Put the
high
disabled
moral
actress
ground.
into a Shakespeare play because we know how it works.
Okay, lovely. Good for her. Great.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see it. When is that happening next?
About like half an hour, like 2 weeks. No,
Is
no,
it?
No, it's not far away. It's a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to wind up, the verb to love comes from the Old English lufian, which means, among other things, to sow love, to practice. Love's a gesture, a sowing and a practicing of incorporation, an extension of the body and the mind to encompass or encounter others undefended. Love is an act against despair. It's a way of working, a social gesture. A live performance is an act of love, and it's a gift of what we value and wish to pass into the future, hand over hand over hand. Our cultures are the knowledge by which we go on and with which we sustain ourselves. The word sustain means to lift up, to hold aloft. Liz Lerman writes of a former shipbuilder who said of her piece about the Portsmouth shipyard that he was filled and lifted up by seeing men like himself dance and speak about their work. Think of the work, writes Rebecca Solnit, as a participant agency and not as a masterful agent set apart from the world that sustains it. Art, Vicky, is the feather and the stone. Emma, it is the gladness and the stone, and I'm not even going to try to explain that because it's just so obviously true. The theatre maker Chris Good reminds us that the possibility of change is not beyond, it is not beyond. It is here, if we can just stand to look at each other. Making live art as a social gesture, as a gesture of sociability, allows new possibilities to be rehearsed and performed. It's a model for a better, more engaged and effective way of living. The sociable gesture of a performance orientates audiences and art making towards one another and insists that they mutually generate meaning. It's a suggestion, a what if. What if we create new rituals of encounter together as both a production of what Fred Moten calls differentiated presence and as a metaphor for what such presence might make possible? Recognition, acknowledgement, learning, grief, new awareness, kinship, joy, dancing in the streets. All that is important, said Martha Graham, is this one moment of movement. Do not let it slip away unnoticed and unused. My stepmother, who has Alzheimer's, can no longer summon a vocabulary to correspond with her intentions. She gathers words and objects from within the spreading darkness and offers them in lieu of what she feels and what she means. But she accompanies everything with gestures, pure forms of expression untethered from the rational lines of language, hand shapes that surround the lost mountain of her reality. When all else is forgotten, the gesture remains, the gesture remembers. The gesture reminds us that we all came from and go back to the same clay, and that we forge meaning and motivation together across all our differences with just our human hands. Thank you. Thanks, Janine.